It was just a wedding picture until experts looked closely at the woman's hand and found a dark secret. The afternoon sun shone through the tall windows of the Atlanta History Archives as Dr. Rebecca Morrison carefully inspected a set of early 20th century photographs given by an unnamed family. Among faded portraits, one picture immediately caught her attention, a 1903 wedding photograph. A white man in a dark suit sat stiffly next to a black woman in an elaborate white wedding dress. Their hands were held together, an apparent symbol of togetherness. Rebecca's 15 years as an historical expert had taught her to spot things that didn't belong. This picture felt completely wrong. In Georgia, in 1903, marriage between races was more than just forbidden, it was against the law. The state's anti-miscegenation laws, in place since 1750 and made stricter after the Civil War, made such unions crimes punishable by jail time. Yet, here was photographic proof of what looked exactly like that. She tagged the picture for a high-quality scan, unable to shake the disturbing feeling it gave her. 2 weeks later, while checking the digital copies, Rebecca systematically zoomed in on various parts: the studio background, the woman's jewelry, the man's serious expression. Then she focused on their joined hands. As she increased the magnification, she felt a terrible shock. The bride's fingers were not just resting, they were intentionally placed in a sign of distress, her thumb and index finger forming a subtle but unmistakable plea for help. Rebecca's hands shook as she zoomed in further. The woman's fingers were arranged with clear purpose, hidden within what looked like a married pose, but actually shouting for rescue. This was more than just an illegal marriage, it was proof of something far more frightening. A silent cry had been frozen in time for 120 years, waiting for someone to finally see it and understand its meaning. Rebecca immediately called Dr. Marcus Williams, an expert in African American history and Jim Crow-era documents. When he came to her office that evening, she showed him the photograph without explanation. Marcus looked at it quietly, his face growing increasingly troubled. "This should not exist," he finally said. "Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws in 1903 made this impossible. Unless?" "Unless what?" Rebecca asked, already afraid of the answer. Marcus leaned back, his face hard. "Unless this wasn't really a legal marriage. Unless this photograph documents something entirely different. Force being held against her will, or worse." He added, "Look at her face. That's not the look of a bride, that's terror barely held back. They spent hours examining every detail." The studio stamp read, "Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio, Atlanta, Georgia, August 1903. A faint note on the back said only, "Mr. Charles Whitfield and servant, not wife, not bride, servant." The word hung between them like a curse. "He didn't even try to hide what she was to him," Marcus said quietly. "This photograph was never meant to show a marriage. It was meant to show ownership." Rebecca felt sick. But why the wedding dress? Why stage it this way? Marcus found old records on his computer. Control, humiliation. Some white men during this time used their power over black women in terrible ways. They couldn't legally marry them, but they could still force them into situations that mocked marriage, a cruel imitation that pleased them while keeping their social standing. The woman had no rights, no protection, no way out. That night, Rebecca could not sleep. She kept seeing the woman's face, her purposefully positioned fingers, the silent cry that had lasted over a century. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most chillingly, had anyone seen her signal at the time, or had it remained unseen until this moment, far too late to save her? The next morning, Rebecca and Marcus began their search at the Georgia State Archives. They needed to find the identity of both people in the photograph. The name Charles Whitfield was their starting point. The archivist, an older black woman named Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, who had worked there for 35 years, noticeably tensed up when she heard the name. "Charles Whitfield," she repeated slowly. "That's a name that still matters in certain groups, though not the kind anyone should be proud of." She went into the records room and came back with several boxes. The Whitfield family was important in Atlanta from the 1870s through the 1920s. They made their money in cotton and cloth after the war. Charles Whitfield inherited the family business in 1898. The 1900 census showed Charles Whitfield, age 28, living in a large house on Peachtree Street with significant wealth and many servants listed in his household. Rebecca's stomach tightened as she read the names, all black women and girls, ages ranging from 14 to 30. One entry caught her attention: Louisa, age 16, domestic servant, literate. Marcus found property records showing that Whitfield owned several buildings around Atlanta, including a textile factory where he hired dozens of workers, mostly black women and children, working in terrible conditions for very little pay. Newspaper articles from the time praised him as a modern employer and a community leader. The difference between his public image and what they were finding was sickening. They looked for more information about the woman in the photograph. If she had been listed as servant rather than by name on the photo's note, finding her identity would be difficult. But Mrs. Hayes had an idea. If the photograph was taken in August 1903, check the city records for missing persons reports or unusual events around that time. Sometimes families tried to report when their daughters vanished, even though the police rarely did anything. After 2 days of checking incomplete records, Marcus found a police report from September 1903. It was short and dismissive, but it gave the first real clue. Report filed by Henry and Martha Johnson regarding their daughter, Louisa Johnson, age 19, employed in the household of Charles Whitfield. Family claims she's not been seen in over a month, despite living just 2 miles away. Mr. Whitfield states Miss Johnson is fulfilling her agreed-upon duties and is in good health, no evidence of wrongdoing, case closed. Rebecca checked the name against the 1900 census. There she was, Louisa Johnson, age 16 in 1900, living with her parents and 3 younger siblings in a modest home near Auburn Avenue. Her father, Henry, worked as a carpenter. Her mother, Martha, worked as a laundress. The family could read and write and owned their small home. They were part of Atlanta, striving black middle class, trying to build a life despite the overwhelming weight of Jim Crow. Marcus found more records. In 1902, Henry Johnson had been hurt in a construction accident and could no longer work. The family fell into debt. A note in a local church's charity records showed they had asked for help in early 1903. "This is how it happened," Marcus said, his voice heavy with sadness and anger. Whitfield saw a chance, a family in desperate need, a young woman with no choices. He offered a job, probably promised good pay. They then found a letter in the church records, written by Martha Johnson, to the pastor in July 1903. "We have not seen our Louisa in 3 weeks. Mr. Whitfield says she's well and working hard, but he will not let us visit her. He says it would mess up the household routine. Reverend, my heart tells me something is wrong. My daughter writes to us every week without fail, but we have gotten no letters. When I went to his house, the servants would not look at me. Please, can you help us?" The pastor's response was noted in his journal. Spoke with Mr. Whitfield about the Johnson girl. "He promised me she is healthy and happy, just busy with her duties. He expressed annoyance at the family's worries and suggested they are being ungrateful for his kindness in employing her. I am inclined to believe him. The Johnsons must trust in God and not cause trouble for a respected gentleman who has shown them Christian charity." Rebecca tracked down the Morrison and Wright portrait studio records through the Georgia Historical Society. The studio had operated from 1895 to 1910, and remarkably, some materials had been saved by the photographer's descendants. She contacted James Morrison, the great-grandson of William Morrison, the studio's founder. James invited them to his home in Decatur, where he kept an extensive archive of his great-grandfather's work. William Morrison photographed Atlanta society for 15 years, James explained, leading them to his study. He kept detailed journals about his clients and his work. He was also quietly the son of an abolitionist who struggled with photographing the uglier parts of Southern society. He pulled out a leather journal from August 1903. "I've read through all of these over the years. Some entries stayed with me. This is one of them." He opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began reading, August 17, 1903. "Today, I performed perhaps the most disturbing task of my career. Charles Whitfield ordered a wedding portrait, but there was no wedding. The young Negro woman he brought to the studio was clearly not there willingly. She wore an expensive gown that didn't fit our height. and her eyes held such deep fear that I nearly refused the job. The entry continued. Whitfield insisted on posing them as a married couple with their hands joined. The woman, he never used her name, only called her girl, began to tremble when he grabbed her hand. I noticed bruising on her wrists as I positioned them for the photograph. When I looked into her eyes to make sure she was facing the camera properly, I saw desperation there. She was trying to tell me something, but with Whitfield watching her every move, she couldn't speak. James turned the page, his voice becoming strained. As I set up the exposure, I noticed her fingers moving slightly, repositioning themselves into what looked like a deliberate pattern, a signal perhaps. I said nothing, but I made sure to capture it clearly. I took 3 exposures. Whitfield wanted to ensure he got a perfect image. After they left, I felt physically ill. I knew what I had photographed wasn't a wedding, it was evidence of something criminal. But what could I do? Report it to the police? They would laugh at me for suggesting a white man of Whitfield's standing had done anything wrong. Marcus broadened the investigation to look at Whitfield's history more completely. What they found was a pattern of exploitation that spanned years. Through court records, property documents, and newspaper archives, a disturbing picture emerged. Between 1899 and 1905, at least 6 families had filed complaints about daughters who had gone to work for Whitfield and subsequently lost contact with their families. Each case followed a similar path: a black family facing financial difficulty, a young woman, usually between 16 and 20, hired as a domestic helper, initial letters home that suddenly stopped, family members turned away when they tried to visit, police reports filed and immediately dismissed. In 2 cases, the young women eventually reappeared months later, refusing to talk about their experiences, their spirits clearly broken. Rebecca found testimony from a woman named Sarah, who had worked for Whitfield in 1901. She had given a statement to a black community organization documenting abuses by white employers, a record that existed outside official channels because official channels refused to hear such complaints. Mr. Whitfield kept 3 of us in the house, Sarah stated. We were never allowed to leave. He told us if we tried, he would have our families arrested for theft or our fathers lynched. He did whatever he wanted to us. We were his property in everything but name. The testimony continued. There was a girl there when I arrived. Couldn't have been more than 16. She was in a room on the 3rd floor and we weren't allowed to speak to her. I heard her crying at night. After a few weeks she disappeared. Mr. Whitfield said she had stolen from him and run away, but I knew better. She wouldn't have left. She was too afraid of what he would do to her family. I got out because my brother threatened to tell the newspapers. Whitfield let me go rather than risk attention, but I know others weren't so lucky. Marcus found records showing that Whitfield had connections to local police and city officials. He made regular donations to political campaigns and hosted social gatherings for Atlanta's elite. He had complete protection, Marcus said sadly. The system protected him. The police worked for him. The courts treated him with respect. And black families had absolutely no way to fight back. Their daughters could be taken, abused, even killed, and there was nothing they could do about it. Despite the terrible things they were uncovering, Rebecca stayed focused on Louisa herself. The photograph showed more than just a victim. It showed resistance. The hand signal captured forever in that image was an act of defiance, a refusal to let her captivity go unrecorded. She knew, Rebecca said, looking at the photograph again. She knew that photograph might be the only proof, so she left a message. Through Martha Johnson's letters to various groups and churches, they tracked the family's desperate attempts to find their daughter. In October 1903, Henry Johnson, despite his injuries, tried to force his way into Whitfield's house. He was arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace, spending 2 weeks in jail. The incident made the newspapers, but the coverage was completely sympathetic to Whitfield. Prominent businessman harassed by deranged former employee's relative. Martha wrote to the NAACP's Atlanta chapter, newly formed in 1903, "My daughter is being held against her will by Charles Whitfield. She came to his home as an employee and is now his prisoner. I've not seen her in 4 months. She would never abandon her family on her own. Please, someone must help us. We have tried every legal way, and no one will listen because we are Negro and he is white and wealthy." The NAACP responded, but their investigation hit the same walls. Their lawyer, a black man named Robert Foster, tried to get a writ of habeas corpus. The judge refused to issue it, stating there was no evidence of illegal detention and suggesting the Johnson family was making outrageous claims against a respected member of society to extort money. Foster documented the case but could go no further without risking his own safety and career. Then Marcus found something unexpected. A letter dated December 1903 from a white woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who had been Whitfield's neighbor. She wrote to her sister in Boston, "There is something deeply troubling happening next door. Charles Whitfield has a young Negro woman in his house whom he claims is a servant. The situation seems far or sinister. I have seen her only once looking out from an upper window. Her face was bruised. I tried to speak with her when Charles was away, but the other servants refused to let me in, clearly scared. I am thinking about reporting this to someone, but I fear no one will believe me or care." The trail of Louisa's story grew cold after December 1903, and Rebecca feared the worst. But then Marcus found something in an unexpected place, the records of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. in March 1904. A woman named Louisa had been admitted with severe injuries, brought in by members of a black mutual aid society who had found her near the train station. The hospital records were few but revealing. Female patient approximately 20 years of age. Gave name as Louisa but refused surname. Multiple injuries in various stages of healing including broken ribs, cuts and signs of prolonged physical abuse. Patient extremely traumatized and barely speaks. Exhibits profound fear of men, especially white men. Patient has indicated she escaped from somewhere in Georgia, but will not provide details, stating, "He will kill my family if I tell." Rebecca's heart raced as she read further. The hospital had contacted a local organization that helped escaped women, both those fleeing the lingering effects of slavery and those fleeing abusive situations. A social worker named Catherine Wells had taken responsibility for Louisa's case. Her notes provided more context. "This young woman has been through unimaginable trauma. She flinches at sudden movements and has nightmares that wake the entire ward. Over several weeks, she has slowly shared parts of her story: forced captivity, repeated sexual assaults, separation from her family, and constant threats against her loved ones if she tried to escape." Catherine's notes from April 1904 recorded Louisa's words, "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He took everything from me, my freedom, my self-respect, my connection to my family. The photograph he forced me to take, wearing that white dress, was the worst day. He wanted to pretend I was his wife, that I had chosen to be there, but I made sure to leave a message in that picture. I moved my fingers just so, a distress signal I had read about in a book. I didn't know if anyone would ever see it, but I needed to try. I needed there to be some proof that I hadn't gone willingly." The records showed that Catherine had helped Louisa contact her family through carefully secret messages to avoid alerting Whitfield. In May 1904, Louisa's mother, Martha, received a letter. "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am, only that I am safe now and getting better. The man who held me believes I am dead. Please let him continue to believe that. It is the only way to keep you and father and my siblings safe. I will write again when I can. I love you. Your daughter." Marcus found the final piece of the puzzle in Atlanta newspaper archives from March 1904. A small article reported, "Fire at Whitfield residence claims life." Authorities report that a tragic fire happened at the home of prominent businessman Charles Whitfield last evening. One servant died in the blaze. Mr. Whitfield stated that the young Negro woman, whose name was not recorded, had been careless with a cooking fire. The body was too badly burned for identification. The incident is considered a tragic accident, but a black newspaper, the Atlanta Independent, told a different story in a carefully worded article. Sources within the Negro community report that the servant, who supposedly died in the recent fire at the Whitfield home, had in fact escaped weeks earlier. Several witnesses report seeing a young woman, matching her description, running from the property in February. The fire appears to have been deliberately set to hide the fact of her escape and to threaten other potential witnesses. Police have refused to investigate further. Louisa had escaped, and Whitfield had covered it up by claiming she died in a fire. He couldn't admit she had gotten away without revealing the truth of her captivity. He had to keep his image of respectability, so he invented a death and moved on. For the Johnson family, this meant they could never publicly acknowledge their daughter was alive without putting her in danger. Rebecca and Marcus found letters between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells. Spanning years, Catherine had helped Louisa start a new life in Washington, D.C., under a different name. She found work as a seamstress and later trained as a nurse. She married a kind man named Edward, a postal worker, in 1908. They had 4 children, but Louisa never returned to Atlanta, and her parents had to pretend their daughter was dead to protect her. Marcus discovered that Louisa kept the story alive in her own way. In 1925, she gave a statement to a commission investigating racial violence and exploitation in the South. She didn't use her real name, but she told her story. "I was 19 when a white man took me from my family and held me captive for 8 months. He could do this because the law didn't protect people who looked like me. He knew no one would believe me if I spoke. He knew my family had no power to save me. But I survived, and I want my story on record so that someday when the world is ready to hear it, people will know what happened to women like me." Rebecca and Marcus spent 6 months gathering their research into a complete historical document. They tracked Louisa's descendants through Washington, D.C. records and found her great-granddaughter, a woman named Dr. Michelle Foster, who taught African American history at Howard University. When Rebecca called her, Michelle's response was immediate and emotional. "We had been waiting for someone to find this story." They met at Michelle's home, where she had kept everything Louisa had left behind. "My great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle explained. She was 94 years old, and she never forgot what happened in Atlanta. She told us the story when we were old enough to understand. She made us promise to preserve it, to make sure it wasn't forgotten. She said, 'Someday someone will find that photograph, and when they do, I want them to know the whole truth.'" Michelle showed them Louisa's personal papers, including a journal she had kept in her later years. One entry read, "I have lived a good life despite what was done to me. I raised 4 beautiful children. I helped bring dozens of babies into the world as a nurse. I loved and was loved. But I never forgot those 8 months, and I never forgot my parents' pain. That photograph exists somewhere with my silent scream far ozen in it. I pray that one day someone will see it and understand. I pray that my story will help people realize how many women suffered in silence, trapped by laws that denied our humanity in a society that refused to see our pain." The National Museum of African American History and Culture organized an exhibition titled "Silent Testimony, Louisa's Story and the Hidden History of Jim Crow Captivity." The main display was the 1903 photograph, shown alongside the photographer's journal, hospital records, family letters, and Louisa's own statement. The exhibition text was clear. This photograph documents not a marriage, but a crime. It shows a young black woman being held captive by a white man who faced no consequences because the legal and social systems of Jim Crow America gave him complete freedom from punishment. At the opening, Michelle stood before the photograph with tears running down her face. Beside the 1903 image was a photo of Louisa from 1960, age 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren, her face calm and strong. "My great-grandmother survived," Michelle said to the crowd. "She not only survived, she overcame. She turned her trauma into purpose, helping other women, raising a family, building a life of meaning. This photograph no longer represents just her captivity. It represents her resistance, her bravery, and her refusal to be erased." Rebecca addressed the audience. For 120 years, Louisa's distress signal went unnoticed. But she left it there anyway, trusting that someday someone would look closely enough to see. Her story is not just about one woman's suffering. It's about the widespread abuse made possible by racist laws and social structures. It's about the countless black women who were also victimized with no way to seek justice. And it's about the remarkable strength of those who survived and built lives of dignity despite everything designed to destroy them. As thousands of visitors moved through the exhibition over the following months, they saw Louisa's hand signal, read her story, and understood the truth that had been hidden for more than a century. The photograph, H, had finally achieved its purpose, not as evidence that could save Louisa in her own time, but as a testament that refused to let her story be forgotten. Her silent cry had finally been heard, and in being heard, it gave a voice to countless others whose stories had been buried by history's deliberate silence.